too.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Major Garrett.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Highbush. For those I've not had a chance to meet yet, and I have the honor of being Executive Director of the Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thank you all for coming out this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who protect us and defend our freedom around the world, will you please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks. Please be seated. Well, let me begin by setting the scene for you. Relations between Congress and the president are a disaster. There's talk of impeachment. Foreign wars and entanglements threaten to upend the national political campaigns. The United States locked in a tense standoff with rival nations. Parents wonder what kind of world their kids will inherit and feel like the country just is coming apart at the seams. Sounds like this morning headlines. Actually, it's early 1970s. A young boy with his cousins overseas in Vietnam consumes all the news that he can. His parents subscribe to Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report. He reads them voraciously. You can practically see this kid sprawled out on the living room floor trying to make sense of the world beyond his home in Southern California. And when the magazines and newspapers are not enough for this young reader, there's CBS News. It's the Cronkite era, and his family is a CBS family. That's the childhood that our guest this evening, Major Garrett, remembers and recounts. No one led him to a journalism career. He found himself fascinated by the news in those tumultuous days of the late 60s, early 70s. After learning the trade at the University of Missouri, he ascended to the ranks inside of CNN, Fox News, National Journal, and now CBS, where he was named Chief Washington Correspondent last December. We are honored to have him with us tonight. President Reagan once explained the importance of journalism this way, quote, "There is no more essential ingredient in a free, strong, and independent press to our continued success in what the Founding Fathers called our noble experiment in self-government." I believe President Reagan was right about the importance of free press, but American journalism and the way we consume it has changed dramatically since his time. We have far more than 3 networks and 3 news magazines. We have limitless supply of news, real and imagined, online. The media landscape can feel overcrowded, confusing, making it nearly impossible to know what to read and whom to trust. Before he covered the Trump White House, before he wrote his newest book, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride, before he covered the 2016 presidential race, the Obama White House, Congress, and the Iraq War, Major Garrett also covered the impeachment of our 42nd president, Bill Clinton. We certainly didn't plan it this way when we invited Major to join us a few months ago, but last week's news and his experience are now really relevant for tonight's conversation even more. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Reagan Library stage, CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent, Major Garrett.
And before we start, I just want to thank you for that welcome as I walked in. And I want to tell you that there are exquisite moments in life when you experience a dream you didn't even know you had. To be here at a presidential library, the Reagan Presidential Library, to talk about my book about this current president is a dream I didn't even know I had. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm deeply gratified and moved by your warm reception, and let's have a conversation.
Great. Well, first, with last week's news about the potential, possible, probable impeachment move in the Congress of the United States, thanks for coming, Major, because I'm kind of surprised with what held back at CBS.
A little dicey, but I made it out here, so it's good. It's good.
Good.
I think if Congress were in, and this were a much more public process as opposed to subpoenas and trying to get things up and running, I would probably have had to stay. But because Congress left for 2 weeks and there is a slight procedural and visibility lull, I was able to escape for a few days.
Great. Well, thank you for coming. I read your book, and it's terrific. It really is a great book, Major. And as I read it, I thought, oh, this book was published, roughly speaking, late spring, early summer, a year ago.
Yeah,
right?
September 2018, yeah.
Right. And I noticed a certain theme and a thread throughout it, and I think I know the answer to this question. I'm going to ask it anyways. So it was published before the following events: the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, the 2018 midterm elections, the second Trump Kim Jong-un summit, and of course the impeachment news last week. And I wondered, do you think your book would have changed course or direction had it just been published last week versus last year? Or no, everything seems to be right along the path that you thought it was?
Well, certainly there have been unpredictable components since the book came out, but there are some through lines. Much of what I write, I have an entire chapter devoted to North Korea, because I think that was an incredibly important news-making part of the first 18 months of the Trump presidency. And that chapter goes into the different way the president approached this issue. And one thing I think is fair to say about President Trump is if he is presented with a problem and he says, well, what have we been doing with it? And he says, well, Mr. President, we've done it this way for 20 years. His first instinct is well, I'm going to do it differently than that. I mean, fundamentally, I'm just going to approach it differently. And that's certainly what he did with North Korea. Now, we don't know the fruits of that, but we do know it's different. We do know there's a level of engagement. And we do know that the president's approach created an aura of unpredictability. Then when I was in South Korea twice, I talked to many people who were very close to this issue, not only geographically, but intellectually. And they say that unpredictability did have a beneficial effect. It created a new possible reality. All of that's explored in the chapter on North Korea. So the second summit is an extension of that chapter, I think. There's an entire chapter in the book devoted to immigration. That's another issue that has been a through line of the Trump presidency. And I speak in that issue in part based on my experience having grown up here in California, grew up in San Diego, and when I worked at the Washington Times, coming back out to California to write about Proposition 187. And I write in the book that the underlying political tensions that Proposition 187 visited upon the state of California, remember that passed 60-40, that was not a close ballot initiative. It was not. It was a decisive victory on the pro-187 side. Had changed in California, but many of those sentiments existed elsewhere in the country. And the sense that people had, and I met so many of them when I went to Trump rallies in 2016, was that there was a sort of bipartisan decision that was never checked with the voters to water down the definition of what it meant to be a legal American. And this question of sovereignty was not incidental to a lot of people in this country. And I write about that in that chapter, which is something quite obviously, as a candidate and as a president, Donald Trump has tried to respond to. So I think there are many things you will find in this book that are consistent with events that have gone on afterwards. Brett Kavanaugh, not the same as the Neil Gorsuch nomination and confirmation, but it is important in this sense, and I have an entire chapter devoted to Neil Gorsuch and the federal bench. That will be a legacy of this presidency. 4 years or 8 years, the transformation of the federal bench under the, and I will say this because it's not always true, and I think if the president were sitting here right next to me, he would nod his head in agreement. Not every aspect of the Trump presidency has been focused, disciplined, with a tremendous amount of repetitive follow-through. If he were sitting at me, all right, I get you, I hear you. But on the federal bench, it has been. This is a distinct part of the Trump approach. Along with Mitch McConnell, the Federalist Society, and others, that has been disciplined and focused and repeating in those discipline and focus throughout. That's an extension of that chapter. Brett Kavanaugh is, how do you approach it? What do you want to do? What are your goals? And how are you going to work the politics and the law to achieve them? So I think there are through lines, even though the book came out, and we timed it to come out just before the midterm elections. Here's a pro tip for any of you who might, in the future, contemplate writing a book about a sitting American president. Don't have your book come out a week after Bob Woodward's book on that same president. That's a bad idea. It wreaks havoc on all your marketing plans.
Well, you know, Major, if we were to walk down the aisle of Barnes & Noble this evening, you know, on the right would be a whole lot of books praising President Trump.
Mm-hmm.
He can do no wrong. And on the left would be a lot of books just excoriating him, and he's the worst thing that's ever
Right.
happened. What I thought was unique about your book is really, and I wrote it down, your question in this book that you try to process is, does Trump matter? Mm-hmm. It's not a right or left, or it's how consequential and transformational is President Trump. And you cite the topics of deregulation, largest tax cut in history, the judicial nominations you just spoke to, the North Korea and China relationship, the immigration, the defeat of ISIS. I think an average observer might say, you're with CBS, you probably can't stand Trump. But you actually have written a book that gets really to the facts of it all.
So what I tried to do with the book, knowing and understanding that the pro-Trump and the anti-Trump book space was fairly well crowded, and also knowing it was much more profitable and would continue to be much more profitable. I didn't write this book to make money. I wish I had, but I didn't. So my motives were aligned with the result. You know, I didn't write it to make money, and I didn't make any money, so there was a profit alignment there. But I really did want to do something that, in an era of scrutiny about what journalism is, and I write about this in the book, is it real? Can it be believed? I wanted to do something that was journalistic and as fairly drawn as possible, and ask questions not about what is interesting or headline grabbing about this presidency, but what is likely to last. Not an easy thing to do. I'm not a trained academic presidential historian, but I've covered the American presidency. I've read extensively about it, and I wanted to take a crack at that. And one of the things I did in the book that I hope will reinforce its ability to at least partially achieve that goal, separating the important from the interesting and being fair-minded, is there are no, if you read the book through and through, you know this to be true, there are no blind quotes in the book. Everything is on the record. Everything. Everyone in this book who is quoted by name and title. Now, that doesn't mean I don't believe in people who give me credible source material on an anonymous basis. I do. I've used them. I will continue to use them. I will vet them, and CBS will vet them carefully to make sure we're not being led down the path. But for this book and on this topic, I thought it was vital to show that this can be done, that it can be done accurately, that it can be done with fairness and a rigorous appraisal, and then see what the sources thought about it when it came out. I'll tell you what they thought about it, not a peep. Not a peep. Which doesn't mean they love it, but they can't and don't criticize it because they know it is what they said, how they said it, everything's transcribed. And would they have written it differently? Would they have puffed themselves up more? Would they have been a little bit more laudatory of this and a little bit less critically focused on that? Sure. But as an act of journalism, this White House has not raised one alarm about this book, publicly or privately, not one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sign it's a good book. You made an interesting comparison about Trump and another U.S. president that it surprised me when I first read it. I thought, I think he's right. And that is your Trump to LBJ.
Mm-hmm.
Explain.
It's very surprising. People are like, what? Wait a minute. Did you say that again? Donald J. Trump and Lyndon Baines Johnson, what could they possibly have in common? Well, as I say, not their geography, not their life history, and certainly not their approach to legislative or presidential politics. No. But in three important ways that are, and were important to both men, they are alike. One, in their physicality, both 6'3". Both used their physique and their physical presence as a way to announce themselves, to take control physically of a room, and to take their measure of people in the room as they responded to their own physicality. Two, they watched a lot of television. Lyndon Johnson was the first president to put network television screens that carried the network news in either the Oval Office or the closest room to his study to the Oval Office, to watch and monitor television news as his way of evaluating how the country was either talking about him or praising him. Donald Trump does the same thing. The third similarity, and I think it's very important, is they both use the telephone relentlessly to gather information on their own. Donald Trump is on the phone all the time. Lyndon Johnson was on the phone all the time. We have this amazing trove of Lyndon Johnson phone conversations because he taped his own in-house telephone system. And those, for presidential scholars, those recordings are an enormously valuable insight into that presidential mind. Well, I don't know if we'll ever have that with Donald Trump, but I do know this. He uses the phone president, I think is a big and important insight into the way they gather and distill information. Not by paper, not by briefing books, not by someone telling them something, but by them, to the degree they can within the White House, gather it themselves and take the measure of the world as they reach out into it instead of the way the world comes to you. Many presidents talk about one of the frustrations of the office and one of the limitations they feel both geographically and psychologically is you're trapped and everything comes at you and you don't get a chance to reach out very much. Physically, that's completely true. Interestingly, to me at least, Lyndon Johnson and Trump's willingness and use of the telephone to get out into that world is an interesting and I think important realization of the way they gathered information.
You make an interesting similar connection between Trump and Reagan in the sense that you give Trump his due as being a great communicator in his own way, as Reagan was a great communicator, but you also note that they practice in far different mediums.
Yes.
Talk to us about that.
So I don't think it's any revelation to this audience, certainly, or to presidential historians, that for his time and for the medium in which he operated, Ronald Reagan was the master communicator of his era. And he became better at it the more he did it. First radio, but then television. As I write in the book, during his presidency, network television was the scene setter for the country. It really was. News magazines had their role, the big newspapers had their role, but network television was really the prism by which the country observed the Carter presidency before it and the very contrasting strength and sort of regal bearing and ambition and optimism of the Reagan presidency, and his ability to communicate that regularly through the network news gave him a potent advantage over his adversaries, not appreciated at the time, frequently derided at the time, but upon reflection, it gained in evaluation. As people saw how Reagan moved the country, held the country, and moved it through both triumph and tragedy, this evaluation afterwards became much more praiseworthy. I don't think there's any question, and I don't think anyone can make a credible argument that Donald J. Trump, as candidate and as president, is the master of the Twitter medium, which is the medium of our time if you are a political actor. It is not the medium of our time if you are not a political actor, but if you're a political actor, Twitter is this incredibly potent tool to not only explain yourself, criticize others, and drive, if not a narrative, drive a course of conversation or course of awareness, oftentimes both. And I saw this during the campaign, which started, as you all remember, with 16 challengers, and over time, Donald Trump continued to rise and rise and rise, and they fell off. But during those early days when everyone was trying to scramble for attention, I covered plenty of Republicans whose well thought out and well constructed day of a speech or a press release or an event or a photo op was essentially ruined by 9 a.m. Eastern. Why? Because Donald Trump had tweeted 3 times and he called into 2 TV shows. And they were obliterated, and they were dumbfounded, frustrated, maddened to a point of distraction, a key phrase, because that ability to distract and knock off your game, your opponents, makes you a stronger challenger. And the president's ability to do that via this new mode of communication is in a class by itself. Is it healthy for my sleep patterns? I ask that largely rhetorically. I think you know the answer. Is it something that the country writ large is entirely comfortable with, in the sense that the presidency is present on almost a nonstop basis? Well, we'll find out. That it is, and that it is of a different level of success and an ability to not only remind Trump supporters why they love him, which it does, it also, and this is a parallel, or not a parallel, but an offshoot of this particular ability, and it's also the same thing that Reagan had, that skill, Reagan's with network television, Trump on social media, drives his opponents batty. It drives them to distraction, and it makes them either act or react in a way that is bigger and maybe more volatile than they otherwise would. People would criticize Reagan harshly. We have a glossy idea of all this era of bipartisanship. Go back and look at the way Reagan was talked about by his opponents in Congress. He was attacked relentlessly because he was so successful on television, it drove his opponents crazy. I think there is a component of that in the Trump ability to drive and withstand and push a message in the social media sphere that drives his opponents similarly to distraction.
One other Reagan reference, and then we'll move on off of that. You may, now from a policy standpoint, things that Trump's accomplishing, you say, I'll quote, you say, Trump merely jabbed his presidential pen across a Reagan-esque paint by the numbers canvas. What did you mean by that?
So I quote Grover Norquist in the book, Americans for Tax Reform, an early acolyte of the Reagan Revolution. And he made the point, and I thought it was worth doing some serious study about, and I talk about it in great length in the chapter I devote to deregulation, because I think it's another very important part of the Trump presidency and will be an important part of its legacy, is Grover said, look, you had a Reagan Revolution and a conservative, but Congress wasn't with him, even the Republican majority Senate was not with him, and he never had a Republican House. And much of the Congress that exists now is a Congress that reflects many of those underlying conservative principles of Ronald Reagan. The one big difference, of course, is on trade. But in the main, on tax cuts and approaches to health care and other defense policy, certainly regulation, it was a Congress that was already in a kind of Reagan state of mind, if you will. And that's one of the most important things about the Reagan Revolution, that it wasn't only about a single person at a single moment of time. It created not only people who thought like that, but who ran for office, embraced that agenda, won on that agenda, then brought that agenda in another generation to state legislatures and the United States Congress. So that paint by numbers thing is, did Trump think of all these things? No. Did he have a deep and intuitive grasp of them at the policy level? No, in some cases. Taxes, yes. Other parts of it, no. But did he have a direction? And did he have a willing and able and energetic Congress in this Reagan mold to assist him? Absolutely. So it matched. Just because it's a paint-by-number picture doesn't mean it's ugly. Mm-hmm. It's just a picture that's created in a different way. And I think that's a fair appraisal of what his instincts were and direction was, and the willingness and the eagerness of a Republican Congress to help him move that forward.
Well,
and deregulation's a classic example of that.
Given that, were you at all surprised that, Donald Trump was a real estate mogul, a New York kind of guy? I mean, he had donated a lot of money to Democrats. Mm-hmm. He had given money to Hillary Clinton and the Clintons. And did it surprise you that, from a policy perspective, he just immediately tacked to the right and started drawing, paint by numbers Republican?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it did, in the sense that if you were to have asked yourself the kind of question we have historically asked ourselves about candidates for the presidency, which is, how does their biography inform the way they will govern? It's a question we've typically asked, and for good reason. But one of the things that makes President Trump so unique is that at this time of evaluating what you needed to be to make a good president, he burst through all of those pre-existing resume items. He had never run for office, never won office, had no governing record, did not lead troops successfully into a significant battle. The three political things and the one military thing, one or the other, sometimes both. If you had both, you were really in good shape, but one or the other was definitional of every previous president who occupied the office. So as I write in the book, Trump had none of that, and we elected him. That tells us something about what the country now considers acceptable on the resume of a future president. And that idea that you have to be ideologically consistent, and only by knowing your biography can we have some sense of that, also was put to the side. What was as important, and I would argue for many Trump supporters I met, and I attended more than 70 Trump rallies during the campaign, was, are you going to confront the system? The system. Will you confront it? How aggressively will you confront it? And how can I judge your willingness to be aggressive? Getting back to Twitter, that was one of the ways the candidate, then president, reminded his supporters he would be aggressive, by constantly driving the system crazy with his unconventional pronouncements, attitudes, speeches, everything else. So what you were going to do with the system, how aggressively were you going to confront it, became much more important than, well, are you a pure ideologue or not? Or have you voted, or have you done this, or who did you give money to? Trust me, plenty of Republicans who were not on the Trump train tried to knock him down by running ads, and super PACs ran ads against him. He gave to this Democrat, gave to this Democrat. And what Donald Trump, the candidate, said is, yeah, I gave to everybody. And that's how I know the system is screwed up. And people said, that's right. That's how he knows. They're not like, well, here's our ideological list. No, you've given to both sides. Instead of saying, I'm of the system and I've grown up and I've acculturated in it. He said, no, I've paid for it. It's all sham. It's mostly phony. And I'm going to tell everyone it's phony. And I'm going to bring something different. The country is and will continue to evaluate how much of the system he's confronted, how much he's changed it, how much it's changed him. All of those are still unanswered questions. But that he brought that rawness to the fundamental question of the system, and having participated in it, said for himself and then to his supporters, that's how you know I know. Because I've played both sides. Because that's what I do. I'm a businessman. Businessmen play both sides if they have to. That's what I had to do. And for every other politician, that was like a disqualifier. That level of honesty and like talking about politics like that. No, it was an authenticator. And that authentic nature was I want you to all know, everyone here, the first chapter of the book, I take myself to task for missing a lot of this, okay? I don't come to you as a know-it-all on this at all. The first chapter of the book is with things I missed, what I should have seen but didn't. And I've tried to study this in retrospect, evaluate what I missed, why I missed it. So I'm not here to tell you that I know all of this or I have this massive unified theory about President Trump or candidate Trump. But I've tried to learn. I mean, I really have. And the first thing you have to do when you're trying to learn is turn that lens of introspection on yourself and say, well, should you have known some things? Should you have seen some things? The answer in my case was yes. And you can read all about that in the first chapter.
In fact, in describing what you learned about Trump, you defined his management style. I thought was an interesting phrase. You said it's purposeful, vindictive chaos, right?
That's not bad.
Yeah.
I can turn the occasional phrase every now and again.
But you are.
And what I mean by that is the president, and he did this as a businessman, and he has this, I would say, this gyroscope in which he remains balanced while all around him is thrown off balance, principally by him. And he uses that as a tool to not only measure how people are going to react and what their ability to remain balanced is, but also when he says, you've heard him say this so many times, we'll see what happens. What I believe he's saying is, I have a pretty good hunch what's going to happen. We'll see if I'm right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I really do believe that. And I've spent an inordinate amount of the last 5 years trying to figure out what he means by we'll see what happens. And that's as close as I've come.
And you are unique in that there's not a lot of people walking this planet that have many, many opportunities to, be within a few feet of him and look him right in the eye and actually talk to him and pester him with questions and all those things, given the role that you've played. And you say with Trump, having been that close to him, you say with Trump, every encounter is about demonstrating power and balancing power. Don't give Trump an inch. He's always testing you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fair appraisal. And the tests are not always about core sort of masculinity or femininity, like what are you in this moment and we're up against each other, but can you read the moment and can you handle the moment and can you get what you're trying to get and he knows you're trying to get it? Let me give you a classic example of this. So we were in the Oval Office and I was the network pool representative that day. And this was during a period of time, and there were many, of course, when the Mueller report had not been written, it had not been submitted to Congress, there were, and I tried to avoid this, but my media colleagues tended not to, a lot of speculation about what was either happening or about to happen. And that morning, the president had put out a series of tweets that any careful reader of his history of Mueller-related tweets would have said, well, he's kind of angry this morning. I mean, there's something that's really got him angry. And this was not long after the Jim Acosta saga in the East Room. And I'll be happy to talk about that if you want to. And so this whole question of deportment and whether the president was going to talk to reporters and how you got a question asked and answered was sort of heavy in the air. So we're in the Oval, and the president finishes his remarks and quickly says, thank you, which is usually the signal to his staff, get us out of there, which is the way White Houses do that. The president has a catchphrase. His staff knows, I'm done, get him out of here. Perfectly natural. There's nothing hostile about that. There's nothing unprofessional about that. That's the way it works. But I caught the president's eye, and I just did this. I need one. That's all I did. I need one. One finger. I mouthed the words. Didn't even peep. What I said is I need one, meaning I need one question. And he's like, that's a test. He knows what's heavy in the air. He knows I could scream. He knows he shut it down. He's told the staff to move us, but I have a different approach. It's quiet as a mouse, literally as quiet as a mouse, respectful, almost sort of like pleading. I got 6 questions. And they were all newsy. And I'll just get straight to the Acosta thing. Let me give you the bottom line for being a White House correspondent. There's only one purpose of being a White House correspondent: to get the president to answer your question and inform the American public. Anything you do to get in the way of that is not doing your job. Period.
Yeah, well said.
But that test thing is what I'm getting at. That wasn't like a big, but he's like, that's good. That's like the president saying, that's probably the only thing you could have done in this moment to get me to answer a question. And you did it. So guess what? You get some questions answered. You know, that's what I mean. And so I'm not offended by this idea that everything is a test. I sort of rise up to it like, oh, you know, you better have your game, because he's always got his.
In just a minute, I'm going to turn to the audience and allow you to ask questions. I have about 500 more in case you don't have any. But let me ask you a helicopter question. You know, Trump's changed the rules on the daily White House press briefing.
Sure.
It doesn't even seem to exist anymore.
It does not.
Right? And I know there's been a lot of consternation about that. Oh, well, you're not, you know, stepping out in front of the American people with... Meanwhile, just about every day, you guys are camped out 20 feet from that helicopter, and the noise is roaring. And there seems to be a method to Trump's madness, and that is, you know, get that noise revved up, give himself an excuse to either not hear a question, pass by and give a message when he decides he wants to, and it seems like he's granting a ton of access on a very informal basis. How is that? What's your preference? Would you like to go back to the days when the White House press secretary sat there for an hour? Or, you know, how do you feel about this new world that Trump's created?
So it's a multi-layered question, because there are a lot of different dimensions to this. But first of all, Donald Trump is the most accessible president I've ever covered. And it's not even close. More accessible than Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama. Not even close. Which means we get to ask the president more questions more frequently than any other previous president. That's all to the good as far as I'm concerned. I don't trouble myself with, well, you're amplifying or you're giving him this bully pulpit. Hello, he already has it. He won it. He's the 45th president of the United States. When he speaks, it is by definition news. And that he speaks so frequently is his prerogative. And so that aspect of the Trump presidency is new, and it's great for those of us who cover him. And I don't know what the market share of the media will be when the Trump presidency ends. He always says, well, you all go out of business because you won't have anything to write about. I don't know if that's true, but when he says, you'll miss me, he's not wrong about that at a certain level. Right. I will miss the access because I'm quite certain whoever comes after Donald Trump will not be as accessible as he is. So that leaves you with this other question, this multi-layering of the answer. Is that better or worse than a daily press briefing? Oh, I believe it's better, and I've always said that. I'll take the president over a press secretary every day and twice on Sunday. Always go to the source. Who's the principal? The principal's the president. Who makes the decision? The president. Whose mind do you want to know as much about at any given moment? It's the president, not the press secretary. So, in the main, I think it's better. Does the public lose something by not having daily briefings? Yes. What is the thing that it loses? It loses the ability to take questions that are on the outer edges of the day-to-day news traffic and force the press secretary and by extension the administration to answer those questions. Things that you would not throw at the president in the 8 or 10 minutes before he gets on the helicopter because you've got to get whatever that most pressing issue of the day is. But you might ask a question about India or Pakistan or Kashmir, something that is important in the world, but not central to that day's news cycle. And the lack of administration talking about things like that or answering deeply detailed questions about this new agreement with Guatemala or El Salvador, that takes away something from just learning about policy and forcing the administration to articulate its approach across a wide array of issues on a daily basis. That is something the public is losing. So it's a mixed bag. It's not all one or the other. I will say this, though. I mean, one of the reasons he does this on the South Lawn before he gets in the helicopter is he'll talk to us for 30 minutes. By the time he gets to the Air Force One, it's on television, and he watches himself on Air Force One. Because that's who he is. I got him all riled up. I turned him on this and that and this and that, and I watch him. I'll watch him with me. I'm going to watch. And that's just part of it. Again, that's not a value judgment. That's just part of it.
It's how he rolls.
It's how he rolls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Neat. Questions. If you have a question, I hope you do, raise your hand as this nice gentleman is doing, and we'll bring a microphone to you, and you can ask, please.
Yes, I have 2 questions. The first is, has the free press, in your opinion, been able to resolve how easily President Trump has been able to manipulate the press? And the second, depending on this coming year's events, will there be a wild ride too?
So let me answer the second question first. One of the determining factors if there will be a wild ride 2 is how well wild ride 1 sells. Which is why I'm here. So in the argot of the days, if you could do a brother a favor, like I tell all my dearest friends, look, you don't need to read it, just buy it, okay?
Makes for great Christmas gifts.
The press, as John mentioned in his very kind remarks at the top, American media is a completely different organism than it was when I entered the business in 1984 after graduating from the University of Missouri. I was a cop reporter in Amarillo, Texas for 2 years. Then I went to Las Vegas as a cop reporter there for 2 years. Then I was at the Houston Post for 2 years, and I made it to Washington at the tender age of 27 in 1990, and I've been there ever since. And I've watched the industry change before my eyes. Newspapers at the community level do not have the centrality and they're not the connective tissue that they once used to be. They're not as profitable as they used to be, for sure. They've shrunk in not only staff size, but in their ambitions. That's had a negative effect on local news TV stations, because I will tell you, local TV stations usually read the newspaper, and that was how they got their sense of the news and chased it accordingly. So the shrinkage of community-based newspapers has had a negative effect, I think, on journalism writ large, because that's a great training ground. It was an essential training ground for me. Covering Washington would have been so much harder had I gone straight to Washington. Living in Amarillo, Texas for 2 years was a tremendous education for a boy who grew up in San Diego and didn't know anything about West Texas. Living in Las Vegas was a tremendous education for me. Living in Houston, a big city with this incredibly interesting and kind of florid history of oil and gas development, was a fascinating thing for me. I learned a lot about America by not living in Washington, okay? And that was essential to my maturation as a young reporter. That's very hard to find. If you want to cover politics now, you come straight to DC. You don't go through the low minor leagues of American journalism, which is sort of the way I think about it. Amarillo was single A ball, Las Vegas was double A, Houston was triple A, and then I got to the show, you know. So that's a way of saying the way we think about the media now is so much more diffuse and has these sort of pillars of ideological representation in them that they never had when I first started. You may have thought there was media bias, but now there's a distinct network that you can go to watch one kind of news and another network on cable where you can watch what you think is another kind of news. And on the internet, as John indicated, there are all sorts of things you can get that are essentially there to reinforce and re-remind you of the things you feel or think or thought before you even opened up the web page. So that's sort of the media environment. And I always, when I try to answer these questions, say I'm just one reporter who's had a career that has spanned a lot of these different places. I mean, I've been in Washington nearly 30 years. So I was at the Washington Times for 7 years, and I was at Fox for 8 years. So for 15 of those 30 years, I was, from the left perspective, part of the right-wing media, okay? Well, the other 15 years, I worked for U.S. News and World Report, CBS, CNN, and National Journal. So from the right-wing perspective, I was a left-wing stooge for 15 years, okay? I don't know what that makes me, except rather thoroughly employable, I think, is one thing you can say. But I've lived in these worlds, and I've lived in newsrooms where you have this idea, well, the media's screwing that up because they're not seeing the story the way we see it. I've lived in those different worlds. I think it makes me a better reporter. It makes me a better journalist because I've heard the criticism of both sides in newsrooms I've worked in. I've been able to sort of go in and out of these places. And I haven't been, if you would to say it, in a bubble of one kind of media orientation. I think that helps me. I think it's instructive in the way I approach this book. To your question, will the media ever figure out how much Trump games them and turns them in circles? Doubtful. He's so good at it. And the one thing I've told my colleagues at the White House, with very limited success, is look, this is no time for emotion. Not only professionally is it no time for emotion, I know you get rankled and I know you feel there's this sort of primal thing and you want to fight back when he says the fake news is the enemy of the people and all that. I said, look, he's just calling the question. He's just asking what journalism is. Our job is to prove that every day. And don't be emotional about it. Not only professionally, that's your responsibility, but you can't outplay the emotional game with Donald J. Trump. And the day you try is the day you lose. Because he's very, very good at it. And he knows the media better than any president who's had that office in our history.
Yes. I will go here and then over here. Yeah.
First, I have an observation. I'll watch Trump at a press conference and he'll call out the fake news. No, you're the fake news. And then you'll see him point, not you, I like you. And I was wondering if one of those not you, I like you is you, because he seems to enjoy taking questions from you. So that's my first question.
Right. He's never said I like you to me. One time we were actually in Singapore at the Kim Jong-un summit afterwards, and the president had a very long press conference. He thought I was John Roberts from Fox. And of course, I'll just tell you this, you might know this, but there's a fascinating thing about John Roberts and I, okay? So when I worked at Fox, John Roberts was the chief White House correspondent for CBS News. And he was to be the heir apparent of the big anchor chair, and he didn't get it. Then he left CBS and went to Fox. I left Fox, went to National Journal for 2 years, then came to CBS as the chief White House correspondent. So when we see each other, we're like, we just have this thing between us, like, I was there, you're here, we were, and so, but the president obviously knows John Roberts, always wants to call him the Fox correspondent, which is his prerogative. I have no problem with that. But he looked at me and he said, John. Thinking, and because in the light, our hair looked somewhat similar. And John and I had fun with it. The president had fun with it. But he doesn't say to me, I like you. But he does, I think, with frequency call on me because he knows what's going to happen. I'll ask a question, he gives an answer, and that's that. But I don't get the condemning stuff in public. He's never done that to me, not once.
And thank you for that. And my question, what will presidential campaigns look like post-Trump? Is it going to go back to just being boring? Because I think I totally think he's just reinvented, and looking at the Democrats running, it just looks the same old boring, and then there's Trump. So what does it look like after Trump is done?
It's a fascinating question. What does it look like when the Trump era is over, whenever that period of time is? That I just don't know. But I do know that it looked different than it ever had looked before. I write in the book that if the negative appraisal of Donald Trump as a candidate is that he was too egotistical and he was too self-loving and he always talked about how great he was and how he was sort of the master of his own narrative, I observed that that's not altogether culturally inconsistent with the selfie culture that is about everyone else's own narrative. Maybe that's much closer to the mark than we ever imagined. We don't even know our own psychology was at play because we're creating our own narratives, and we're not, I don't mean everyone in this room, I don't even mean myself, but just generally as a culture, we're much more fascinated with our own narratives and our own storyline. And if we watch someone do it at such a level, like, wow, that's really good. Maybe that fits in our times. I will hazard this guess, though. If people try to be Trump who are not Trump, they can have the policy positions, and certain members of Congress have embraced them and won. But try to be Trump is, I don't think, possible. I really do think I think he's an American original. And we have all sorts of American originals. You know, we're a big country. But I think he is an original. And I think it'd be very dangerous to try to be like Trump, because only he can be who Donald Trump is.
Yeah. Here.
Two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, I think many of us get extremely frustrated that the news is not reporting or investigation of the deep state and all this payola and corruption and arms deals. Why isn't the news following that? And my second question is, how do you know, based on your 30 years in Washington, how do you think this impeachment's going to play out? And I don't hold you to know for certain, but you know, I know a lot of us just bluster. How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, let me talk about impeachment for a second. So I covered the Clinton impeachment, as John mentioned, which meant I spent time not only covering that story and everything around it, but as you would expect a reporter to do, you reach back and look at the precedent to the degree there was established by the Nixon process. And I went back and read about Andrew Johnson, the impeachment process then. And one thing that's happened every time we've done this is the House, before the inquiry process has taken its full approach to gathering facts and then submitting them to the House in formal articles, there's been a vote by the House to establish the inquiry. That's the way we've always done it. It was done with Nixon, it was done with Clinton, it was done with Andrew Johnson. It's pretty clear, and the Speaker's top advisor told me this today when we were texting before I got on my flight here. The Speaker's not going to do that. There's no intention. It's not constitutionally bound, not legally required to do that. Right? Well, that's true, but that's inconsistent with the precedent, number one. Number two, when courts have been asked to evaluate the potency of a subpoena from the House in an impeachment matter, that underlying vote, the will of the full House, has carried weight. It hasn't been determinative, but it's been something courts have paid attention to. For good reason. It's the institutional vote of a co-equal branch of government on this very serious matter of an impeachable offense. And this information must be gathered to render a judgment about that. Well, if the House isn't going to vote on that, then that's an inquiry without an institutional voice behind it. Some people might fairly say that doesn't sound consistent with what we've done in the past, and Maybe there's something politically timid about that, or something lacking justification. And that's their call. I mean, if you're going to start an inquiry, I mean, and this is something you've heard from the White House, and just because it's a White House talking point doesn't mean it's invalid. I think it is valid. As a matter of precedent, it's really important to do this. And if you're not doing it, I think you owe the country an explanation as to why. Why aren't you having a vote? Are your members uncomfortable with the vote? Well, if they're uncomfortable with the vote, that means they're uncomfortable with the inquiry. Well, if they're uncomfortable with the inquiry, why are you having it? Now, if the House is comfortable, then vote. Debate it and vote. And then at least the institution of the House has rendered a judgment that for all time can itself be judged. And I will say this about impeachment. I said this on the evening news last week. No one escapes unscathed. History evaluates every component of a president's conduct and Congress's attitude in relation to that conduct. And the question of impeachment is the most grave question we ask ourselves constitutionally about the fitness of a president. It is not ordinary business. And to say you're approaching it with due seriousness is not enough. You must prove you're approaching it with due seriousness. And history will judge you harshly if you are not, and if you didn't. Many Republicans look back on the Clinton impeachment and say, we said we were serious, but the country didn't believe it. And we suffered as a result. And we look bad historically as a result of that. That's not Democrats, that's not Bill Clinton, that's Republicans themselves who were House managers and the like. So this is serious, serious business. And it's not good enough to say you're being serious. You have to prove you're serious. About the deep state and about corruption and things, that's front and center of what's going to be this battle. I mean, it's already emerging. And the news today, well, the Attorney General talked to the Australians and the Brits and well, of course he did. The President's authorized him to look into the root causes of the Mueller investigation. That's clearly within the purview of the Justice Department, and the Attorney General made it clear in his confirmation hearing he would investigate that. Well, you can't investigate that without talking to the Australians or the Brits or other people associated with or around either the Steele dossier or things that led to questions about the Steele dossier. I don't know what he's going to find, but I know he's on it. And that has to be fairly evaluated and laid against everything else we've learned. And if the Mueller investigation taught, I think me, I don't know if it taught everyone this, this idea that there could be no questionable actions, motives, or interests within the FBI, well, that's been pretty thoroughly debunked. There were. The Inspector General has been pretty caustic about that. No one's been charged with a criminal offense in the main, but the reputations of people who once had sterling reputations have been justifiably sullied because they were not on the up and up in every regard. And that came out. Things will come out. Things will come out.
We have time for one last question. We'll go right here. Thank you for your patience.
Good. I got this in as more positive because I am raptured with your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. Thank you for mentioning that.
The reason is because all this vitriol and all this stuff we've been talking about here just gets so old after a while. Mm-hmm. And what you bring through that is so much knowledge and so much information.
Thank you.
And I've taken notes on so many of the things that you've done and read. And just like with Natasha Cloud, just little thing,
right.
Talking about that. And so thank you.
Thank you for that.
But I have to ask you a quick question. Mm-hmm. Your co-friend Tim, he wrote a book at the same time?
Tim Penny?
Yeah, he wrote
my first two books I co-wrote with Tim Penny, the congressman.
No. I'm talking about you interviewed on a podcast.
Oh.
I believe his name was...
Oh, Tim Alberta.
Yeah, thank you.
Who wrote American Carnage.
That's what I took notes. I lost my notes, and I need to read them both. Thank you.
Okay, great. So the gentleman was so kind to mention my podcast. So I'll be doing a 5-second, well, it'll be longer than that. Let me do a 55-second commercial for my podcast. Okay, if you like podcasts and you are interested in politics and policy and a little bit of pop culture, I have a weekly podcast called The Takeout. Why do I call it The Takeout? Because it's always built around a meal. the conversation is always built around a meal. Why? Because I think it's fair to observe in all of human existence, most interesting conversations happen over a meal. Why? Everyone relaxes a little bit. Everyone comes down a little bit. Everyone gets off their A game. Well, if there's a city in America that needs to get off its A game or get off its sense of being constantly aggressive and relentlessly on its talking points, it's Washington, D.C. So I wanted to have a conversation. I always describe the show as a conversation, not an interrogation. And it's a 40-minute podcast, and the promise I make to the audience is our guests are never edited, not one word, ever. If we have to cut anything for time, it's always me. So we never, ever have a conversation after the show about context. What I ask and what they say, whoever it is played in its full. Point one. Point two, as we say at the show, at the beginning of the show, and I created the show, so it's my baby, and I love it, is we're two things every week. Relentlessly curious and steadfastly non-ideological, which means we don't pander on my show. So, classic example. 2 weeks ago, I had the Interior Secretary, David Bernhardt. He's an incredibly important person in the future of public lands in this country. And he's carrying out the Trump administration agenda, as he said, with tremendous gusto and intensity. And he took every question I had for 40 minutes. He hardly ever gives lengthy interviews, almost never. Did for 40 minutes with me. Covered all sorts of ground. The next week, we had Democratic presidential candidate Michael Bennet, okay, who basically says the president runs a criminal enterprise from the Oval Office. I'm not saying David Bernhardt is right, and I'm not saying Michael Bennett's right. I'm not involved in any of that. What I say is, you're a person who's involved in this process. I ask you questions, you give answers, and my audience learns. That's it. That's my whole role in creating this podcast. And part of the inspiration was my frustration with my own medium, television, which is very good at falsely compressing space and time. Because television has to. We take a whole day and we miniaturize it into 20 minutes, and the 20 minutes are miniaturized into minute 30 TV stories. So I would frequently do a fascinating interview with somebody that would last 20 minutes, and 7 seconds, if I was lucky, would make it on the air. Sometimes none of it would make it on the air. And I would say to myself, I've got to be able to do something in this space that doesn't waste all these things I've just experienced. Why do I only get that? I said, I'll create a show. So I did. So thank you for listening so very much. Thank you. Yeah. That's my commercial. It was like 6 minutes. I apologize for that.
Well, Garrett, we're out of time, but there is plenty of time for you to stick around and have Garrett sign a book for you. I really hope that you do that. And I just, on behalf of the Reagan Foundation, this terrific audience, we just want to say thanks so much for coming, Garrett.
Thank you for being here. Thank you. I'm honored by your presence. Thank you.